Welcome back to another peaceful journey through Scripture. Take a deep breath. Let the weight of the day drift away and find comfort in this moment of stillness. Tonight, we reflect on a profound lesson from Jesus, a story of mercy, grace, and the power of true forgiveness. Life often presents us with challenges, moments where we are hurt, betrayed, or wronged. But how do we respond? Do we cling to resentment, or do we extend the same mercy that we hope to receive? As we unwind together, let's open our hearts to this message of second chances, of releasing the burdens of bitterness and embracing the peace that comes with grace. This story, spoken by Jesus himself, reminds us that the forgiveness we receive is the forgiveness we are called to give. Now close your eyes if you wish, relax, and let's begin. The soft murmur of conversation filled the air as Jesus and his disciples sat together, the warmth of the day slowly fading into evening. They had traveled far, their feet dusty from the road, their hearts full from the teachings he had shared. Among them was Peter, ever bold, ever questioning, his mind turning over the weighty lessons of love, grace, and forgiveness. He leaned forward, his voice breaking the evening's hush. "Lord," he asked, "how many times should I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" His words carried an air of generosity. 7 was a number of completion, a number of divine significance. Surely, forgiving someone that many times would be more than enough. But Jesus turned to him with a gentle yet firm gaze, his next words unexpected, almost startling. "I do not say to you 7 times, he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of his answer to settle, "but 77 times. A murmur rippled through the group. 77 times? Some exchanged glances, others furrowed their brows. The idea seemed almost impossible. How could anyone be expected to forgive that much? Could forgiveness really be limitless? Jesus, seeing their uncertainty, knew that the best way to explain was through a story, a parable that would take them beyond mere numbers and into the heart of what true mercy meant. And so, as the fire crackled softly and the night air carried his words, he began. Jesus' voice was calm, yet the story he was about to tell would carry deep meaning. There was once a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. This king, like any ruler, had the authority to demand justice and settle matters of finance, but what made him stand out was what was about to unfold. The people gathered around could imagine this grand king, his throne, his royal robes, and the many servants who carried out his commands. But this wasn't just a tale about royalty. It was about the nature of mercy. As the king began calling his servants one by one, each must have felt the weight of their debts. The king, powerful and commanding, had the right to settle accounts, to demand repayment for what was owed. And then the scene focused on one servant in particular, a man who owed the king an unimaginable sum. This servant owed the king a debt of 10,000 talents. It was a sum so large no one could even begin to imagine how to repay it. It was a debt that would take generations to pay off, if it could be paid off at all. For the servant, this was a hopeless situation. No amount of pleading, no work, no time could ever repay this debt. The servant, realizing the dire nature of his predicament, fell to his knees before the king. His heart pounded in his chest. "Have patience with me," he begged, his voice trembling with fear and desperation. "I will pay you everything." But the words didn't feel real. How could he ever repay such a massive debt? How could anyone? And yet, this is where the story takes a surprising turn. Jesus paused in his telling, letting the listeners feel the tension in the air, waiting for what would happen next. As the servant knelt before the king, his heart heavy with the weight of his enormous debt, something remarkable began to happen. The king, who could have easily commanded that the servant be thrown into prison or sold to pay off the debt, did not respond with anger or retribution. Instead, he looked upon the servant with compassion. In that moment, the king saw more than just a man who owed him money. He saw someone who was desperate, someone who had no means of repaying the debt, someone who had no hope. The servant's plea was filled with genuine remorse, and the king's heart was moved by it. What the servant needed most in that moment was not punishment, but mercy. And so, the king made an extraordinary decision, one that was both unexpected and deeply generous. He declared, with a voice filled with grace, "You are forgiven. Your debt is completely wiped away. You no longer owe me anything." This wasn't a partial forgiveness or a delayed repayment plan. This was a complete and total forgiveness of a debt that could never have been repaid. The servant, who had been drowning in the weight of his debt, was suddenly freed from it. All the years of struggle, all the anxiety about how to repay, were gone in an instant. He had been given a fresh start, a new beginning, completely undeserved, yet given freely. The servant, still kneeling, couldn't believe what had just happened. The enormity of the situation was difficult to grasp. He had been forgiven a debt beyond comprehension. The king had shown a mercy that was beyond what anyone could expect, and it was this very mercy that would serve as the foundation for the lesson that Jesus would later share with his followers. But for now, the servant stood there, his mind racing to process the forgiveness that had just been extended to him. The burden that had weighed so heavily on him had been lifted, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the lightness of freedom. The king's mercy had changed everything for him. As the servant left the king's presence, his heart must have been filled with a sense of overwhelming gratitude. How could he repay such kindness? How could he ever show the same generosity that the king had shown to him? The servant, newly forgiven, stood up from his knees, still in awe of the king's immense mercy. As he left the royal court, his heart was likely filled with relief, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of freedom. The weight of his debt, once so crushing, had been completely lifted, but soon his gratitude would be put to the test. Not far from the king's palace, the servant encountered another man, a fellow servant who owed him a much smaller amount. A debt that, while still significant, was nothing compared to the vast sum he had just been forgiven. The amount was just 100 denarii, a sum that could be repaid in time with hard work. It was a debt that could be settled. The second servant, seeing the first servant, likely felt the same weight of anxiety. Perhaps he too was struggling with his own burden, but when he saw the man who had just been forgiven a staggering debt, he must have hoped for kindness or understanding. Surely the servant who had just been shown such incredible mercy would now show the same grace to him. But what happened next was shocking. The servant who had been forgiven did not see his fellow servant with eyes of compassion. Instead, he grabbed him by the throat and began to choke him. "Pay me what you owe," he demanded in a harsh, unforgiving voice. His actions were not those of a man who had just received mercy, but of one who had already forgotten the very grace extended to him. His anger and bitterness had taken hold of him, overshadowing the mercy he had been shown. The second servant, just as desperate, fell to his knees. "Have patience with me," he begged, his voice trembling with fear. "I will pay you everything." His plea mirrored the very words the first servant had spoken to the king, yet there was no kindness in the first servant's heart. Instead of showing mercy, the forgiven servant's heart had hardened, and he refused to show any compassion. Without a second thought, the first servant had the second servant thrown into prison, demanding he stay there until the debt was repaid. The man who had just moments ago been set free from an impossible debt now became the one who held another prisoner, unwilling to extend the same mercy he had received. The scene must have been stark. The contrast between the first servant's overwhelming mercy from the king and his own cruel, harsh behavior toward the second servant. The one who had been forgiven so much now chose to forgive nothing. His heart, once softened by grace, had turned cold. The mercy he had been shown had not transformed him into a person who would extend that same mercy to others. The actions of the first servant did not go unnoticed. Word of his cruelty spread quickly, and soon the other servants who had witnessed the scene came before the king. They had seen what had transpired, the way the forgiven servant had treated his fellow servant with harshness instead of kindness, despite the incredible mercy he had just received. They were horrified by what they had witnessed and felt compelled to tell the king. Then his fellow servants saw what had been done, Jesus said, and they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. The king, upon hearing this news, was deeply angered. His mercy, so freely given to the first servant, had been betrayed in the most painful way. The king had forgiven a debt that could never be repaid, yet the servant, having been shown such incredible grace, had turned and shown no mercy at all. Instead, he had chosen to be unforgiving, to act with cruelty, and to throw his fellow servant into prison. The king's anger was righteous. It was the anger of a ruler whose generosity had been met with disregard and cruelty. The king had extended a hand of mercy only to have it slapped away by the servant's ungratefulness. Then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant." Jesus spoke the king's words with firm authority. "I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" The king's words stung, and in the next moment, the servant would feel the full consequences of his actions. And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. The king, who had just moments before shown boundless mercy, now reversed his decision. The servant was thrown into prison, not as a chance for redemption, but as a consequence of his unforgiveness. The same mercy that had been extended to him was now revoked because he had failed to show that same mercy to others. The servant, once free, was now trapped once again, not by his original debt, but by his own refusal to forgive. The king's actions serve as a powerful reminder. Mercy is not a one-time act, but a call to live in a way that reflects the grace we have received. The servant's failure to show mercy had cost him everything. What he had been freely given was now taken away, leaving him to face the consequences of his hardened heart. As the story came to an end, Jesus turned to his disciples, his words now carrying a weight of profound significance. The parable had unfolded with its shocking twists: the king's mercy, the servant's cruelty, and the devastating consequences. Now, Jesus would draw the lesson from this story, a lesson that resonated deeply with the hearts of his followers. So also, Jesus said, "My heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." The words were clear, unambiguous. Jesus was pointing to the truth that forgiveness is not just a one-time act, nor a simple gesture. It is a reflection of the heart. True forgiveness comes from within, from a place of genuine mercy and grace, not just outward compliance. Jesus wasn't merely telling a story about a king and his servant. He was using this story to illustrate a deep spiritual principle about the nature of forgiveness. God, in his boundless mercy, forgives us all, regardless of the weight of our sins. We stand before him, much like the servant in the story, unable to repay the debt we owe. And yet, God forgives us freely and completely, not because of anything we've done to deserve it, but because of his love and grace. But here's the powerful truth: the forgiveness we receive from God is not meant to end with us. It is meant to be shared. As God has shown us mercy, so too are we called to show mercy to others. When we choose not to forgive, we are like the unforgiving servant, holding others to debts that we ourselves have been freed from. Jesus' lesson is not about simply forgiving in word, but in action and spirit. To forgive from your heart, means to truly let go of resentment, anger, and bitterness. It means releasing the desire for revenge and choosing peace over punishment. It means letting go of the past and moving forward with a heart that reflects God's love and grace. The challenge is clear. Forgiveness is not optional for those who follow Christ. It is a command, a way of life, and a reflection of the grace we have received. The measure of forgiveness we extend to others is the measure of forgiveness we invite into our own lives. To withhold forgiveness is to hold ourselves captive, just as the unforgiving servant was held captive by his own refusal to show mercy. Jesus' words are a call to transformation, a call to live with open hearts, willing to extend the same grace that has been given to us. The story of the unforgiving servant serves as both a warning and a reminder. God's forgiveness is freely given to us, and in response, we are called to forgive others with the same boundless grace. As we take a moment to pause and reflect on the story of the unforgiving servant, it's important to consider how this lesson touches our own lives. The call to forgive is not just an abstract principle. It is something we are invited to apply in our day-to-day existence, in the relationships we cherish, and even in the ones that are broken or strained. For many of us, forgiveness can feel like a difficult challenge. Life brings moments of hurt, betrayal, and misunderstanding. There may be people in our lives who have wronged us, intentionally or unintentionally, and the pain they've caused can feel overwhelming. It's easy to hold on to those hurts, to nurse the wounds, to believe that forgiveness would mean letting them off the hook. But the lesson Jesus teaches in this parable invites us to reconsider this perspective. Forgiveness does not mean that the offense is forgotten, nor that the wrongdoing is excused. It means that we release the hold the hurt has on us, allowing ourselves to be free from the anger, bitterness, or resentment that can consume our hearts. In the same way the king forgave the servant, God forgives us, not because we are deserving, but because his mercy is boundless. And in the same way, We are called to forgive others, not because they've earned it, but because we too have been forgiven much. In our own lives, there may be people we've struggled to forgive. Perhaps there's someone who has caused us deep pain, and the thought of offering forgiveness feels impossible. The parable of the unforgiving servant teaches us that forgiveness is a choice to release the hold of past hurts and to open our hearts to peace. When we choose forgiveness, we allow God's grace to work in our hearts, transforming us and freeing us from the chains of unforgiveness. It may not be easy. It may take time. But forgiveness begins with a decision to let go, a decision to stop holding others' wrongs against them. This decision doesn't negate the pain or make it disappear, but it allows us to move forward with a lighter heart, no longer bound by the past. Perhaps today we can take a moment to reflect on the people in our lives who we are still holding unforgiveness toward. Maybe there's a person or a situation that we've been unable to let go of. Take a deep breath and invite God to soften your heart. Ask for His help in forgiving, and remember that forgiveness is not a one-time act. It is a way of living, a daily choice to release bitterness and choose grace. In practical terms, forgiveness may look different for each of us. For some, it may mean having a conversation with someone to express our pain and offer grace. For others, it may be an internal decision to let go of the hurt and allow healing to take place. But regardless of the form it takes, forgiveness is always a choice to align our hearts with God's mercy and to reflect the love He has shown us. As we continue to reflect on this story, may we be reminded of the incredible mercy God has shown us and the forgiveness we are called to extend to others. Just as the king forgave the servant an insurmountable debt, so God has forgiven us the debt of our sin, a debt we could never repay. Let that grace flow through us as we seek to forgive others with the same mercy and love that we have received. As we come to the end of this peaceful reflection, let us take a moment to rest in the message of mercy and forgiveness we've encountered. The parable of the unforgiven servant is a powerful reminder that forgiveness is not merely a duty, it is a gift that, when shared, brings healing, peace, and freedom to our hearts. Forgiveness is not always easy, but it is always worth it. In choosing to forgive, we open ourselves to a deeper understanding of God's love and grace. We let go of the weight of anger and bitterness and allow God's peace to fill the space where resentment once lived. As you move forward in your life, remember the grace that has been extended to you and allow that same grace to flow through you. You are forgiven and you are called to forgive, both for your own freedom and for the healing of others. Thank you for joining me tonight. May this message of mercy stay with you, bringing comfort and peace in the days ahead. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to reflect on it throughout your journey. May you find peace in the act of forgiveness, knowing that each moment of grace you extend makes the world a little kinder. Good night, and may you rest in the peace of forgiveness.